After you have stretched your canvas, so again, you have your canvas stretched over the stretcher bars, make sure that the canvas is tight on the stretcher bars. So again, that canvas should be tight to the touch when you touch the center part of the canvas. And the next step is to prime the canvas. So this gets the canvas ready for paint so that when you paint on it, the paint just doesn't seep into the fabric of the canvas. The gesso is something we call prime, is to hold the paint onto the surface. So you need to get one of these plastic things so that it protects my table. They're underneath the sink, the very back sink. There's quite a few of those so that it protects the table while you're doing this. There's a few different ways to do it. One, you can either use a brush or you can use a sponge to put the gesso onto the canvas, and we'll need to do 2 coats. I like to put the gesso into some of these containers just because they're a bit easier to get your hand in there. Another way to do it is either dipping the brush and using the brush like this, to put the canvas on, put the gesso on, and you just want it to be into even coats. Now the reason I'm not a fan of the brush is because, as you can see, there's usually bristles that you have to go back and get the bristles out. So what I like to do is I like to just pour a bit of the gesso into the center like that. And yes, this is going to be a bit messy. And then use the sponge to move that around from the center, kind of moving it around to the edges. And make sure if there's any excess that you make sure that it drips onto the plastic tray rather than onto my tables, because otherwise it's just a mess to clean up. Another thing is you definitely want to wear an apron during this, because if the gesso gets on your clothes, or be very careful if it gets on your shoes, it's very difficult to get gesso out. It is a water-based primer, but still it is challenging as to get that out of your clothes. Okay, so I've got a nice even coat here. I'm just moving it around. Now I'm taking some of that excess off of there, and I'm going to make sure that I do the sides. Make sure you do the edges of the canvas. Again, I'm taking some of the excess and going right on the edges there. On this side, you can see where those triangle folds are, and making sure I'm getting gesso in there as well, onto the edge. And the reason is because when we're doing a painting on canvas, you'll want to paint the edges so that it gives it a completed look. Even if it's just the color of your underpainting, it needs to have some color on it, on the edges. And then if it's painted, the edges, you really don't have to frame it. You don't necessarily have to frame it. It can just be hung on the wall just as it is. Okay, so nice, even. You'll see that some of those brush strokes will disappear as it starts to dry. Make sure to wash out the sponge right away, or the brush, whichever one you were using, because if the gesso dries in the sponge or in the brush, then I just have to throw them out, okay? So you're gonna let that dry. And that will probably take overnight to dry. And then you'll have, so once you let it dry, you'll see, here's one that's dried overnight. And so the next step is that you need to take a piece of sandpaper. So here's the sandpaper, and you need to lightly sand it. So just any of the little imperfections, if there's bristles from the brush, maybe pieces of the sponge, you need to sand those off. So just give it a light sand over the whole thing, even on the edges. And then you're going to do a second coat of gesso, over that. And then you'll need to let that dry again overnight. Okay, so at least 2 coats. Once you do the second coat, you probably won't see these brush strokes anymore. Once that's dry, the second coat, you're going to give it another light sand one more time, and then it's ready to paint on. And then you have finished building your canvas.